that's kind of a good place to start.
Yeah.
We arrived in Washington on the very day that the bailout failed, and we were astonished at the feeling of peace and order and tranquility that permeated the whole downtown area. People imagine Washington, some people will think it's the center of the evil empire, but when you get there, it's so quiet and ordered, and I got the instant image of this is the center of the hurricane. We're right in the center of the hurricane.
Yeah, I mean, and you know, you discover how little control any one individual has of events. I mean, the unraveling of the financial markets, all based on this invention of a couple of grad students from MIT in the early 90s. I mean, that's what it's all about. I mean, a lot of people don't understand how, in a way, infinitely complex it is, but how simple in its essence. And its essence is simply the idea that mortgages and debt could be insured, so that you could take on more and more debt because you were paying some company to insure your debt so that the debts wouldn't default. So the more confident you were, the more debt you were willing to take on, and suddenly you had, you know, these strange instruments being traded as commodities, which were nothing more or less than the presumption of responsibility for debt. But once you couldn't actually fulfill that responsibility, the whole system unraveled. So this idea that, for example, an insurance company would go into the business of insuring debt as opposed to insuring property or whatever. The problem is that if my house burns down, the insurance company's on the line for one house. But if that company is insuring massive arrays of debt, and the thing starts to unravel, the whole system sort of falls apart. And that seems to be what's happening. And it's, you know, it's kind of haunting that it's coming at the end of an administration that is not just a lame duck presidency, but is a dead duck presidency. You know, there's simply no moral capital remaining in what has been, in my opinion, for a very long time, a bankrupt administration.
Yeah, that's what's happening. And we don't want to make a disaster scenario movie. The reason it's called Earth Pilgrims is we want to, a lot of people are aware of what's happening and have been aware a long time. But there haven't been too many people who've come up with rays of light at the end of this tunnel, who can put it in a perspective that allows us to see it as maybe something different, as a rite of passage, maybe too grandiose to think of it as a transformation. I don't know.
Well, you know, we don't know where it's going to lay, where it's going to end up. But I mean, you know, the point I've been trying to make really in all the work that I've done is that this construct that we call the West, you know, the descendant of the Enlightenment, modern industrial, scientific, technologically driven culture, which we in our hubris and like all peoples are sort of fiercely loyal to their own interpretations of reality, and most cultures are fiercely ethnocentric. We have this kind of conceit that this form of economic activity that we call modernity or whatever is somehow the real inexorable wave of history, and that these other ways of doing things, whether it's spiritual, cultural, economic, are somehow failed attempts at being us, failed attempts at being modern, you know, failed attempts to really be on the wave of history. And this is really the conceit that drives the whole development paradigm for so many years, is that, you know, we export a way of thinking about the economy as if it is inevitable, when in fact it's just a social construct. It's just one way of organizing economic and political activity. And the frightening thing is to realize that the depth of that way of being or that way of thinking is scarcely 300 years old. And that, in the scheme of things, is a pretty shallow history, and it shouldn't give us the confidence to assume that this is the only way of doing things. And the point that I'm always trying to make as an anthropologist, and I guess the whole profession of anthropology tries to make, is that these other peoples of the world don't represent failed attempts of being you or failed attempts of being modern, but that you represent unique answers to a fundamental question. What does it mean to be human and alive? And when asked that question, they respond with obviously 6,000, 7,000 different voices, which collectively become a kind of human repertoire for dealing with the challenges that are going to confront us in the ensuing millennia. I mean, I've just come back from Australia, where I was making a film about the dreaming, the notion of the dream time. And, you know, it was really a revelation to me, because I had never been with, or, you know, experienced a different cultural reality so profoundly, antithetically distinct from that of my own. You know, people speak often about people, say, in West Africa or Haiti or in Brazil or whatever, you know, moving on Brazilian time or Colombian time. It's always sort of a disparaging comment, you know. But the truth is that in the Aboriginal mind, there is no time. There is no word for time in the language. There is no concept of the linear progression of life. There is no sense of past, present, or future. In fact, those notions are completely incomprehensible because to the Aboriginal individual, because they are in opposition to everything they have come to believe. And what you realize is that the Aboriginal trajectory, or the Aboriginal experiment in intellectual endeavor, was really unique in human history. And whereas in the West, we have taken it as a given, this notion of progress. You know, the one sort of motif of our entire philosophical tradition is improvement, change. You know, whether it's technological change, self-improvement through spiritual growth, physical modification of the body, from everything from diet to plastic surgery. We take it as a given that we can, and this goes back a long way. I mean, this is why when the British first washed ashore in Australia, they didn't just think that the Aboriginal people were strange, which they were to their eyes. There was something about the Aboriginal way of thinking that deeply offended the British, and that was largely because they were very, very evidently a people, a civilization that had no interest in progress, no interest in improving their lot, no notion of, and so the British looked at that and saw primitive technology, no ceramics, no wheel, certainly no written word, no agriculture, very limited material culture, and concluded from their point of view the obvious: these people were savages, no wonder they're so quote-unquote primitive. Well, of course the British had no sensitivity to the subtlety of the Aboriginal mind, and there was a very clear reason why the Aboriginal civilization did not embrace the cult of progress, and that lies in one of the most elegant ideas ever brought into being by the human imagination, which is a dreaming. And whereas in the West we embrace progress, change, improvement, the entire logos of the dreaming is constancy, symmetry, balance, stasis. In other words, the purpose of humanity is not to improve upon their lot, but rather to engage in the ritual and ceremonial activities that by their very nature maintain the world exactly as it was at the time of the first dawning, when the ancestral beings walked the song lines and sang the universe into existence. And so what you see there is in a fascinating way, is the consequences. In other words, you know, if humanity had followed that line of thought, if you will, we would not have put a man on the moon. But on the other hand, we wouldn't be talking about our capacity to destroy the biological life supports of the planet either. And I think that's a really important point, because, you know, these cultures aren't just decorative. You know, culture is not decorative. It's not about feathers and bells or how you look or the songs you sing, even the prayers you utter. Culture is fundamentally about a set of values that you insulate the individual with, moral and ethical values, which by definition keep at bay the barbaric heart that history teaches us lies just beneath the surface of every human being. So culture in a sort of geopolitical sense is not trivial. It's what creates civilization. It keeps anarchy at bay. It's what allows us to sort of find order in a universe that may have none, to make sense out of sensation, to always reach for the better angels of our nature, however you want to put it. But in addition, cultural beliefs have consequences in terms of the ecological footprint. You know, and again, it's not the the measure of a culture is not simply the measure of what people do, but the quality of their aspirations. People always get this mixed up. You know, they'll be confused why a people could presumably have an ideal that calls for a kind of a certain relationship to the earth, and then you'll see individuals in that culture clearly abuse that notion. Well, it's not really a contradiction. If someone came to me and said to me, what is the foundation of your worldview, I'd have to invoke the Judeo-Christian tradition. That doesn't mean I go to church every Sunday. So the measure of a culture is both what they do, what they aspire to do. But the bottom line is that cultural choices have real consequences. You know, I was raised in the forests of British Columbia to believe that those forests existed to be cut. That was the foundation of the scientific forestry, which was less a science than an ideology, that suggested that these forests were decadent, over-mature, all this language we use to rationalize their destruction in an economic system that had no place in its calculus for the value of those forests left intact. And yet that worldview that I grew up on, you know, both in school, as a logger in the woods, as a student of forestry at the University of British Columbia, you know, that made me a very different person with a very different relationship to those forests than someone from the west coast of Vancouver Island or the east coast, whatever, you know, Nushalmouth or Kwakilth, who believe that, you know, those same forests were the abode of Hukuk and the crooked beak of heaven and the cannibal spirits that dwelt at the north end of the world, the very spirits that would be embraced during the Hametza initiation, such that the sort of wisdom of the wild would be brought back to the domicile in the potlatch, to the community, to the space. And of course, the interesting question is not whether those forests are the abode of spirits or whether they're simply cellulose and board feet. It's how the belief system, you know, creates a different relationship to the earth. I mean, you know, you went to the Coyariti, and you know, southern Peru exemplifies this. You know, that the notion that the earth is animate and alive is not a metaphor. People literally believe that the earth is alive, responsive to the human aspiration, even as the human destiny is wrapped up in a reciprocal relationship that implies obligations to the earth itself. So that every community in the Andes is dominated by a sacred mountain known as an Apu. And as long as you're in the shadow of that Apu, it will direct in some way your destiny. Now, this is not that esoteric a notion in a landscape in which the mountains quite literally create the weather, in an agricultural civilization and a set of communities in which hail can wipe out a crop in 15 minutes. And indeed, in the early 80s, there was an instance where, you know, virtually, I don't know what it was, 40 or 50% of the maize crop of Cusco in the Sacred Valley was wiped out in a hailstorm. So this idea that the mountains are alive and there's an engagement with the mountains is both a poetic idea, but also a literal idea, you know, in terms of the adaptation of the people. And so, you know, a kid raised to believe that a mountain is an animate being that will direct in some way his or her destiny, again, is going to be a very different child with a different relationship to that place than a kid raised in Montana or in Alberta to believe that a mountain is simply a pile of rocks ready to be mined. You know, we're going through this in British Columbia in a very interesting political campaign to save an area called the Sacred Headwaters as we speak. You know, it's a remarkable accident of geography that three of British Columbia's most important salmon rivers, the Skeena, homeland to the Gitxsan Wet'suwet'en, the Carrier, the Nass, homeland to the Nishka, and of course the Stikine, homeland to the Tahltan and the Tlingit. The headwaters of all three of those rivers, by this amazing kind of accident of geography, are born within walking distance of each other in this splendid set of meadows nestled into this rugged cluster of mountains near the Spatsizi Wilderness. And what's fascinating to me is the only place I know on earth where such an event happens is on the slopes of Kailash in Tibet, where the Ganges, the Indus, and the Brahmaputra all have their origins, or at least are perceived to have their origins. And Kailash is deemed to be so sacred that not only you're not allowed to climb it, you're not allowed to set foot on it. And the idea of imposing industrial infrastructure at the foot of Kailash would be so anathema to 2 to 3 billion people who live downstream on those river drainages, that to do so would be to condemn yourself and all your lineage for all time to the worst of fates. Whereas in Canada, by contrast, we actually, without even blinking, are considering imposing coal bed methane extraction in those very meadows, a particularly invasive technology which demands the injection into the earth of high velocity, high concentration, high pressured chemical soups that crack the anthracite coal and release the methane gas which is suspended in the coal seam, and it can imply the imposition of an incredibly dense concentration of wellheads. Unlike conventional oil and gas exploitation, coal bed methane can demand, at least a wellhead every 40 acres. So you're talking about, in the case of the sacred headwaters, a network of wells, as many as 5,000 to 6,000 wells, placed upon this extraordinary place. And in the Canadian sentiment, it's not even an issue. In other words, one of the things I find so interesting about this sort of issue is that, it says so much about who we are as a people. In other words, what does it really take to do such a thing? I mean, the mining industry is based on speculation. It's based on, a couple of characters in Toronto or in New York getting together, cobbling together these shadowy companies that have no more history than my dog. They can secure the rights to the land without even visiting it by simply going online. They have no experience in the country. They've never felt the pain of a winter or the promise of a spring. As all the First Nations say, this is your land, where are your stories? They have no stories. And even more dramatically and profoundly, the act of desecrating that landscape has no place in the spreadsheet. In other words, in the calculus of economic planning by our system, there is no obligation whatsoever for that enterprise to compensate the commons, which is the rest of us, for the cost of the destruction of the land development entails. I mean, this is rather an extraordinary thing. All they have to do to satisfy the government to get the rights to desecrate a place that should indeed be the sacred headwaters of all Canadians is to guarantee a certain revenue flow through taxation or through royalties and a certain level of employment generated. Well, we shouldn't thank them for generating jobs per se. After all, without the workers and the labor, they can't get the materials out of the ground. Of course they're going to give some jobs to people. How many, for how long, on what terms, And the royalty streams are so trivial that they really just amount to taxation into the provincial coffers, but there's never any royalties to the First Nations. There's never any payment to them to build up the infrastructure of their own lives. And it's a little bit like if I came into your garden and you're selling roses, and I cut a deal with you. I buy all your roses, $1 a piece. You get rid of all your roses, and then as I'm walking out, I say, by the way, the act of me taking these roses from your garden, the bouquet of 50 red roses, I'm going to destroy your house. And you say, wait a minute, that wasn't part of our deal. I mean, what about the compensate? Oh, no, I don't compensate for the destruction of the house. Hey, be grateful. I'm buying all your roses. And we take that as a kind of a given, but it's very anomalous, that idea that the earth itself, left as it is, or the cost to the commons of its destruction, should have no place in the calculus of economic planning. It's bizarre.
It's too bizarre to really wrap our heads around. So maybe I can ask you, as an anthropologist, here's a species that has been around, we reckon, for 200,000 years.
Probably less.
Plus or minus.
Probably 150,000.
150,000. With this incredible diversity of ways of appreciating a place in the universe, an ability to live on the earth in a sacred way, with a proper relationship to the earth. We have this massive bank of memories, of knowledge, of experience. How can a species allow that to be practically completely destroyed in the short space of 300 years has got to be the biggest enigma, riddle in the entire bloody universe. How could it have happened? How can we possibly try
You know, I don't know. I mean, it's interesting. I had never thought too much about the descent of man until I went to look at the Upper Paleolithic art of France and with a poet friend of mine, Clayton Eshelman. And it's quite interesting because, you know, we know that we descended from our direct progenitor, Homo erectus, roughly 150,000 years ago. And for much of our history, we shared the stage with our sort of distant cousins, Neanderthal. And Neanderthal clearly had some spark of awareness. You know, they did make tools, they had ritual burial. But whether it was the development of language, increase in the size of the brain, or some other evolutionary catalyst, you know, our species, Homo sapiens, quickly left Neanderthal gasping for survival. And one of the most amazing things about contemplating the art, the fantastic art of the Upper Paleolithic, is that by the time Neanderthal disappeared from Europe, for example, about 27,000 years ago, our direct ancestors had already, and for more than 5,000 years, been slipping into the belly of the earth to execute that exquisite art. Now, when you go and visit the caves of Dordogne, and you see this Upper Paleolithic art, you know, it clearly has an aesthetic that is astonishing, and it speaks to something far deeper than hunting magic. You know, the technical achievement is remarkable. You know, the use of twisted perspective, the four pigments, the use of the curvature of the stone, the use of the balance between the form on the rock, interplayed and with multiple layers of forms sort of dancing together, all brought alive by the flicker of a tallow lamp, you know. And but what is really interesting is that art form existed as a single aesthetic for almost 15,000 years. In other words, when you look up on the walls, what are you seeing? Well, my friend Clayton had this great way of thinking about it. He said, you know, if you accept the fact that our species at one point was of an animal nature by definition, and you accept that whether we like it or not, at some point we stop being of an animal nature. He viewed proto-shamanism as a kind of, not just a first religion, but as a process whereby we were trying to reconnect with our animal nature across a chasm that was somehow and for whatever reason unbridgeable. And he viewed the art not as sort of symbols of hunting magic, as some anthropologists have said, but really as sort of postcards of nostalgia, you know, attempts to reconnect in some kind of metaphysical way to the animal nature of which we all once were a part. Now, what I thought was so fantastic about that idea and the poetry of it is that, you know, if indeed these were postcards of nostalgia, ours was a very long farewell. Because for over 15,000 years, from Chauvet, which we can date to 33,000 years before the Christian era, to Lascaux, which is 17,000. I mean, that's 15,000 years. That's 3 times the chronological distance that separates us today from the building of the Great Pyramids in Egypt. For 15,000 years, we seem to share the same aesthetic yearning. And then, you know, who knows what happened? You know, we slipped off, you know, the Neolithic Revolution, which brought us, you know, the cult of the seed, the development of hierarchy, surplus, specialization, all the hallmarks of modern civilization. And from then on, you know, and it hasn't been a very deep history, you know. It's interesting, I mean, it's easy to say 300 years for industrial society, perhaps, but even, I mean, the Neolithic is only, what, 10,000 years ago. Well, that's not a whole lot of time, you know, and in that time, you know, clearly we developed the genius and the technology to transform the world around us. And I mean, I think part of the challenge and part of the hope is that, you know, the one great event, you know, the single seminal event of the 20th century in terms of its promise for subsequent millennia occurred on Christmas Eve of 1968 when Apollo went around the dark side of the moon and emerged to see for the first time in human history not a sunrise or a moonrise, but an earthrise. And suddenly we saw, in this way that's been seared into our subconscious, that the Earth was a finite place. You know, as the astronaut said, you know, a blue planet floating in the velvet void of space. And that, you know, had a far more important impact on human intellectual thought than certainly the Copernican revolution of the 16th century that showed us that we were no longer the center of the universe. Because from space you see this fragile planet. And, you know, that veil of atmosphere is so thin. I mean, one of the most extraordinary things, I've been to Everest several times, and, you know, people always talk about in high altitude climbing of the death zone, you know, that place where you can get where the level of oxygen is so low that you cannot breathe. Now, you've experienced it in a minor way at the Coyote, 16,000 feet. You get up into 27, 28,000 feet, and the oxygen is literally, you know, a quarter what it is on at sea level. But what is that really telling you? It's telling you that there's a place on the planet where you can wake up in the morning, have your coffee, have some breakfast, put on your boots, and walk virtually in a single day, vertically, into a place where you cannot breathe. Now, if that doesn't tell you about the fragility of this thin veil of atmosphere that insulates and creates the possibilities for life on Earth, I don't know what else does. And I think that is the great hope, because I think that, you know, we've seen an incredibly profound shift in the last 40 years. I mean, it couldn't have come too soon. But if you think about it, I mean, the last 40 years has seen such a profound shift in attitudes and perspectives. I mean, not only in a sociological sense have we seen sort of women go from the kitchen to the boardroom, and people of color go from, you know, the woodshed to the country club, and gay people from the closet to the altar. We've also seen, you know, this idea of the environment just become part of the vernacular of school children. I mean, you know, 40 years ago when we were kids, just getting people to stop throwing garbage out of a car window was a great victory. No one spoke of the ozone, or no one spoke of biodiversity, no one spoke of climate change or our capacity to affect our own home. Now those notions are seared into the thoughts of children, you know, and this represents a shift in attitude that is both incredibly remarkable in its speed and profound in its hopefulness, you know.
How hopeful, though? How deeply is it seared? Is it seared deeply enough for people to actually feel and experience the world as so many of the native peoples that you've lived with? I mean, that's deep. That's seared.
Well, no, I think.
Sounds like singed.
Well, you know, I think, you know, I think one thing that's happening is that the separation between, you know, us and them, the idea that there's the Western world and there's the indigenous people. I mean, you know, there is no us and them anymore. It's all about human beings on this planet, and you know, I've spent all my time seeking visions of worlds that lie outside of my own. That's why I became so intrigued in anthropology. But I also don't have any romantic preconceptions of I mean, the fascinating thing about human beings really is, and again, this is one of the great revelations of anthropology, is that you know, all human beings face the same adaptive imperatives. I mean, all people have kids, all people have to feed their children and educate their children, all people find rules to bring together man and woman to procreate. The rules may be different, but the adherence to the rules is universal. All people deal with the inexorable mystery that death represents and the spirit realm that lies beyond death. And that shouldn't really surprise us, because, again, the revelation of anthropology and genetics in particular is that we all are truly brothers and sisters. And I don't mean that in the sense of hippie ethnography. I mean, quite literally, we're cut from the same genetic cloth. The studies of the human genome leave little doubt that all of humanity is likely to have descended from roughly 1,000 people who walked out of Africa some 55, 60,000 years ago. Now, if you accept that we're all cut from the same genetic cloth, two important things come out of that. One is it finally puts a spike into the chest of the old canard, that there's a trajectory of progress in the affairs of culture, that there's somehow a linear progression of movement, a ladder to success that invariably placed Victorian England at the apex of the ladder, or of the pyramid that sloped down to the so-called primitives of the world. I mean, it's this idea, which was at the foundation of sort of social Darwinian thought, remained very, very strong up until 20 years ago. And then the second important thing to come out of that is that if we are all cut from the same genetic cloth, it means by definition all human cultures essentially share the same raw intellectual capacity and genius. Now this shouldn't come as a surprise to an anthropologist, but you know, at a time when, you know, less than 100 years ago, or 100 years ago, Australian government was still debating whether Aboriginal people were human, you know, and a time when, you know, in children's textbooks in Australia in the 1960s, a treasury of fauna of, do you want to, is that going to screw you up, that phone? Should we shut the doors maybe? Well, you want to just shut the door? We could even unplug the phone actually. We just shut